Lovely that you could all join us tonight. Okay, what do you think, John? Should we kick off?
Yes, I think we should.
Can you keep watching the waiting room and just admit people as they come in?
Yep, sure.
Wonderful. All right. Well, welcome everybody to our session tonight on Eating for Climate and Health. I'm really looking forward to this evening because I know for me there's just so much that I don't know and I want to learn about this issue. And I'm really glad that you could all be with us for this learning journey. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today. I recognise their continuing connection to land and waters, and I thank them for their protection of the coastline and its ecosystems since time immemorial. And I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I pay respects to elders past and present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. Tonight, I'm joining from Bidjigal land in Bexley, and I'd like to invite everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat and share where you're joining from tonight. So my name is Alice. I'm the Social Justice Lead working at Uniting with John O'Brien, who's here with us tonight. And we're delivering the Synod Climate Action Strategy. So in a moment, I'll introduce you to our guest speaker for tonight, Kate Sievert. This talk comes as part of the work of UCAN, the Uniting Climate Action Network. In 2019, the Uniting Church New South Wales ACT passed a resolution on climate action, for advocacy for better climate policies, to reduce individual and church emissions, and to support youth leadership on climate action, including supporting the School Strikes for Climate. In this work, we recognise the interconnection between individuals, leadership, and systems change that is needed for proper action on climate. The Living the Change initiative has focused on the areas of diet, energy and transport as areas where individuals can take personal action for climate as people who are called to care for God's creation. And so, John, you were talking to me the other day about your own journey as a Christian and as an environmentalist and as somebody who enjoys health and fitness, about making changes to your diet. And I was wondering if you could share with all of us tonight. You're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Won't be the last time I ever do that in my life. Okay, so as Alice said, I'm John O'Brien. I'm part of the advocacy team at Uniting. I've been in the advocacy team for about 8 years. It's fantastic to see so many people at this forum. And look, I'm sure collectively we bring a really broad range of knowledge and experience and perspectives on this topic. I'm also sure there's been a mix of influence that have shaped your beliefs and your actions in this area. So I just want to share a little bit about some of the factors that have shaped my understanding, what there is, and interest of this connection between diet and health and environment. So I don't have any professional background or qualifications either in diet or climate change, but over the years, I've probably been more interested in the connection between exercise and sport and diet in terms of physical health. But I guess my understanding has been evolving a bit. In 2016, I did a Certificate 3 in gym instruction, just out of sheer interest. And one of the subjects in that course focused on diet. And it was probably then that I first heard of the Australian Dietary Guidelines. That's probably, I'm ashamed to admit that, but it was probably the first time. And I learned in that, and I guess I was a bit aware of it, before then, but I learned in that we should be eating, less meat, less junk food. And I heard the phrase calorie dense, nutrient poor, for the first time, and certainly eating more vegetables, 5 serves a day. I didn't even know what a serve was at that stage. And at that time, it was pretty hard to achieve 5 serves of vegetables a day. And I wasn't surprised to learn that the vast majority of Australians don't reach that mark. A little while later, my wife, Merrin, became a participant in the Maintain Your Brain study. This was part of the massive longitudinal 45 and up study that she'd been in since 2006. Maintain Your Brain was looking at maintaining, as it says, maintaining a healthy brain and preventing dementia. And it was looking at the behaviours that would help you to do that. One of the segments of the study focused on diet and championed the Mediterranean diet, which was all about eating more fruit and vegetables, particularly lean meats, healthy oils, nuts, seeds, and those sorts of things. So the study required Miriam to actually keep a food diary and to report regularly on what she had eaten in the past week. And she got a score for how well she'd gone in following the Mediterranean diet. So because she was more aware of her diet, and because she also wanted good scores, we started to change what we ate at home. I did most of the cooking, so I was kind of instructed about what not needed to fit in with the Mediterranean diet. But we started eating quite a lot less meat, significantly more vegetables, and we worked out how to eat 5 serves a day, and particularly more legumes and more meat-free meals. We're not vegetarian, but we definitely changed the shape of our diet. And during this time also, I started to make connections between diet and the environment. Some of that just came through general media. I remember watching the British doctor and journalist Michael Mosley in his documentary, The Truth About Meat. He was looking at the environmental footprint of raising different types of livestock to eat, including, how and where they're raised, how they're transported, all those sorts of things. And it touched on broader issues like land clearing and how much water it takes to, raise a kilo of beef, and methane production, all impacting on the environment. But a big factor in my education came through my work in the advocacy team. So as I work on campaigns to bring about social change in different areas, and the campaigns that I was working on prior to 2019 were things like social housing, people seeking asylum, and drug law reform. And then in the big synod meeting of that year, 2019, in response to very broad-based concern in the church, but particularly from young people, the synod decided to begin a synod climate action strategy. And that included advocacy to government, but as Alice said, also taking action to reduce our emissions across every part of the church, including individuals and households. So I guess I've been on a steep learning curve since then, trying to get my head around climate change in all its facets, or many of its facets, and how we need to respond to prevent the impacts of climate change getting a lot worse. So I guess one point I want to say is I think there's lots of influence on us which shape our views and behaviour, and I've just mentioned a few: the impact of science and research, different media, personal interests and hobbies, and just mundane things like life circumstances and where you happen to be. I don't know about the influences that have shaped your views and behaviour. I guess I do know that as humans, or I hope we have the capacity to keep learning and adjusting our lives according to what we learn. And I'm really looking forward to learning more tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, John. And thank you for sharing your story. I always think it's fascinating for us to kind of reflect on what it takes to make change and what are the influences along those kind of journeys. I now have the pleasure to introduce our speaker for you tonight. So as you listen to Kate, I'm sure you'll have questions come to mind, and we'll have the chance to ask some of these questions later in small group discussions and also in a question and answer session. So what I'd love is if you could just type your questions in the chat as we go, and then when it comes time to do question and answer, we'll do our best to make sure they're addressed. So Kate is here. She's completing her PhD with the School of Exercise and Nutrition Science at Deakin University. She holds a Bachelor of Arts Philosophy and Masters of Public Health. Her research focuses on the political economy of the food system, especially the power and influence of big companies in the meat industry. Kate is also a co-founder and executive committee member of the advocacy group Healthy Food Systems Australia. She's also contributed to policy for the World Health Organization and the Public Health Association of Australia. And tonight we are very lucky to have her talking with us. Kate, I'll hand over to you and I'll get your slides up.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. I'm looking forward to talking to you a bit about diet and climate. And John, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I'm happy to know that everything you shared is very aligned with what I'm about to share today. So before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we convene today, which from the chat seem to be lots of different lands. But for me today, it's the land of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to any elders who join us today. Just next slide.
Yep.
Thanks, Alice. So first, a little bit about me. So I'm a PhD student at Deakin University. I'm in my final 3 months, so I'm about to submit. So it's a stressful time, but we're getting it done. And my PhD, as Alice mentioned, is on the politics of red and processed meat reduction for healthy and sustainable food systems. And I also want to preface this presentation with the disclaimer that I'm not a dietitian by trade. I'm also not an environmental scientist. So as Alice said, my background's in philosophy and public health. So a lot of my work is around policy and systems change. So yeah, just to make you all aware, and so that I don't get specific questions about, which specific type of nut is best. But I do promise to leave you feeling empowered at the end of this presentation with knowledge of what a healthy and sustainable food diet looks like, and also what actions we as individuals can do to better the planet with regard to food. And I'll also do a little plug here for an organization that I run called Healthy Food Systems Australia. So we're an advocacy group, and we're pushing for holistic food policies that address both health and environmental outcomes. Okay, so let's get started. So just next slide. Yep. So where do we start? So we're facing multiple intersecting crises that are driving the push for us to make some pretty radical changes. With the climate crisis to COVID-19, we've got widespread chronic diseases affecting us, and increasing social and income inequality. And whilst a lot of these may seem like they're all separate, they actually share a lot of common drivers. And one of those common drivers is, next slide, our modern industrial food system. So next slide. So first of all, what is a food system? What do we mean by that? When we refer to food systems, we're talking about the sum of actors and interactions across the entire food chain. So we mean inputs like seeds and farming technologies to the farms themselves, production processes like transport, processing, distributing, and selling, and then of course to the food environment, so supermarkets, the restaurants we go to, our homes, and then of course waste disposal. But food systems also encompass the policy environments that surround the chain. So we're talking about the politics, cultural norms around foods, different technology innovations, social and economic factors, and importantly, which is the focus of today, it also encompasses the climate and the natural environment. And all of these are multi-directional, so they reinforce and influence each other in a continuous flow. Next slide. So food systems have developed since millennia, and up until now, humans have managed to eat and coexist with the natural balance of the environment so well that we've survived all the way up until now. And we can look to the examples set by our First Nations communities here in Australia and how they've maintained human health and biodiverse ecosystems across Australia. So Aboriginal Australians ate food that was in season, they never wasted food, and made sure to have balanced and diverse diets. And they were free of diet-related diseases like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. But in the present time, food systems now exist as a series of very complex and interrelated relationships across the globe, constantly expanding to feed the now 7.7 billion people on the planet. But this is causing a huge strain on the planet. Next slide. In fact, if you just press enter, sorry, I'm not sure why there's a little animation. Oh, sorry, yeah. Oh,
Right.
Yeah, we're just missing a picture. Sorry, if you go back. Yep, sorry, no, that's fine. In fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just released its 6th report. just this month or at the end of last month. And there's a section solely focused on agriculture and climate change. And I just want to touch on the image that they use there on the front page of the report, which is titled A Borrowed Planet, Inherited from Our Ancestors and on Loan from Our Children. And I think that's a really poignant note for us all to keep in mind when we're thinking about our interactions with our natural environment. Next slide, thank you. So the mainstream food system that we operate in Australia and around the world now is the modern industrial food system. And it's characterized by often global supply chains, the commodification of food, and highly concentrated agri-food markets, so dominated by big transnational corporations. And whilst this model has done a really good job of increasing access to safe foods and providing us with a steady availability of food all year round, it's not environmentally sustainable, and it's increasingly the cause of social inequity and major public health issues. So one example I put there on the screen is the global value chain of Nutella. I hope you all know what Nutella is. It's the hazelnut spread that some people like to eat on toast. So you can see the source ingredients like palm oil and cocoa are extracted from multiple different countries. It's processed and packaged in a number of other countries, and then it's distributed all over the world. But most of the profits are not shared among these different countries and the people who are extracting the ingredients or packaging the product. Most of the profits go to Nutella, or their parent company, Ferrero Group. And one other thing I'll note is that in recent years, we're also seeing increasing financialization of food. So large financial transnational actors like banks, institutional investors, even Silicon Valley in California, who do all their software and tech, are all involved in funding both agriculture and food production, which ultimately does give them a say in what foods are produced. Next slide. So what products come out of a food system like this? Wonderful fresh fruits and vegetables available all year round? No, just kidding. The industrial food system does allow us to access fresh and safe food most of the time, well, for some of us. But these foods that are on the screen here are the main products that are cheap and easy to produce in a factory, and we call them ultra-processed foods. So ultra-processed foods are foods that are industrial formulations made generally from industrial ingredients that are very hard to pronounce and aren't generally found in your own kitchen. So we're talking hydrogenated oils, protein isolates, and the foods have a pretty poor nutrient profile. So they're high in fat and sugar and salt, and low in fiber and micronutrients that keep us healthy. But most importantly, it's actually the degree to which these foods are altered and processed. So having the water removed from them, adding flavors and cosmetic additives, that research is showing us is what is so harmful about them. So rather than the fact that they have a lot of sugar and fat, it's the fact that they're highly processed and they've had their molecular structures altered so much that are causing us harm to our health. And in Australia, we're seeing that almost 40% of our total energy intake is coming from ultra-processed foods. Next slide. So not only is our industrial food system producing a lot of products that are harmful to our health, but the processes involved in making them and distributing them and disposing of them are harmful to our planet. And this is a bidirectional relationship. So the more pressure that's placed on the environment and its resources, the more that shapes our capacity to make food. So, for example, the more greenhouse gas emissions that are sent into the atmosphere, the more average temperatures begin to rise, the more catastrophic weather events occur, which affect both the yield of various crops. So we get a reduced yield, or the quality of the yield is lower, but also it harms our livestock who depend on living in outdoor conditions. So if we've got really high temperatures, that makes it very uncomfortable, if not unlivable, for the animals we use as livestock. So I'm going to go through in detail these various ways that our current food system places a strain on our planet. So the one you probably hear about the most is greenhouse gas emissions. So food production accounts for about 13% of all of Australia's emissions, and over a quarter of all global emissions. And within this, livestock and fisheries are the biggest emitters. So they account for about 31% of food emissions. Crop production accounts for about 27% of food emissions. Land conversion, so when geographical areas are changed for agricultural purposes like deforestation, they account for about 24% of food emissions. And the supply chain more generally accounts for about 18%. So most of this is in transport, but it also includes packaging, processing, and retail. And the graph on the right there, it's slightly cut off, but it looks at the output from meat production more specifically. So as you can see, red meat sources, so pork, lamb, and beef are the biggest emitters and mainly of methane. But I also want to point out that methane emissions are also contributed to by food waste that's sent to landfill. And there's a stat there that if food waste were its own country, it would be the third biggest greenhouse gas emitter after the US and China. So food waste is a really big problem. And we can see within this that all levels of the food system are an important leverage point for reducing some of the world's global greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to make lots of food, particularly animal source foods, we need land. So in the visualization on the right, we see the breakdown of how global land use is done on Earth today. So about 71% of Earth's surface is what we call habitable land. So that means like fertile conditions for growth, essentially, or so no deserts and no ice, really. And about half of all habitable land is used for food production and agriculture. And there's a highly unequal distribution of land use between livestock and crops for human consumption. So if we were to combine pastures used for animal grazing with the land used to grow crops for animal feed, we could see that livestock accounts for 77% of all global farming land. And to put that in perspective, so livestock takes up most of the world's agricultural land. It actually only produces about 18% of the world's calories and 37% of the world's protein. So it's not really an efficient use of land. Next slide. So we also use a lot of water to produce the food that we eat today. 70% of all global freshwater withdrawals are used for agriculture. And what I mean by freshwater withdrawals, so it means any fresh water that's taken either from the ground or from surface water sources, either permanently or temporarily, and taken to another place for use. And the biggest users of fresh water are dairy cattle and cattle for beef, but also fish, prawns, cheese, lamb, pork, and chicken. So it's our meat and dairy products. Next slide. And our food system is also the primary driver of biodiversity loss globally, with agriculture alone being the identified threat to 24,000 of the 28,000 species at risk of extinction. So that's around 86% of all species at risk. And the global rate of species extinction today is higher than the average rate over the past 10 million years. And this has happened because we've cleared a lot of land and used it for only a few types of crops and livestock. So you can see on the screen there, I've put wheat, rice, soy, and corn. So they're primarily the crops that we use to make the foods that we do today, particularly ultra-processed foods. And this is because it's cheaper to make food in high volumes. It's easier to assess for quality. So we use a very low diversity of monocrops, and we do it intensely. So most farms are focused on producing high amounts of one crop at a time. And we also do this with meat. We're very unimaginative. We rely on mostly cow, sheep, pig, and chicken meat in our diets here in the West. So these are all major contributors to biodiversity loss. We also need to talk about pollution. So we don't talk about this one as much, but the pollution of different bodies of water and ecosystems are a big issue. And some of the processes from the food system pollute the oceans, our air, and also contribute to antibiotic resistance. So some of the ways in which this happens is from the harsh use of harsh chemical inputs and pesticides in industrial farming, We've got runoff fecal waste, particularly from factory farmed animals who also generally have a higher use of antibiotics. And farmed fish production is also a major polluter. So again, one of the main drivers here is meat and dairy production. Next slide. So one of the great PhD students in my Healthy and Sustainable Food Systems group here at Deakin has made this fantastic framework to examine all the ways in which our food systems as a whole contribute to the environmental damage at every step of the supply chain. So I've just put this here to show how these impacts occur at every stage, every level, from production to processing to distributing to our food environment and also to disposal. Next slide. So what does this mean for us? So for future food systems, it might mean production is challenged by shorter growing seasons, changing rainfall patterns and rising sea levels, impacting the quality of crops and food output. For vulnerable populations, it might mean even higher rates of food insecurity and higher proportions of your income spent on food. For human health, we've got reduced air and water quality, higher temperatures, reduced safe living conditions. For pandemic risks, we've got novel zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. So these are propelled by climate-driven changes and environmental stress on wildlife populations. And for climate instability, I think I've quite touched on most of that there. So it's a lot of implications for us and quite serious ones. And who are going to be affected first and foremost and most prominently are populations who experience socioeconomic disadvantage. So our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, people experiencing homelessness, people living in rural and remote areas, the elderly, those already experiencing high rates of food insecurity, as they, like I said before, might be forced to spend more of their income on food due to rising food prices, but also our own farmers and agricultural producers who will face unbelievably harsh working conditions, and of course our native and wild animal populations and their habitats. So what do we do? The good news, we can change it around, and eating for climate also means eating for health. The bad news is it's not an individual problem only, and we're going to need to really challenge the power status quo when it comes to the food system. So there are personal changes we can make to our diets, which I'm going to go into now, but there are also some things we can advocate for our government to do more of in addition. So what is a diet that is both good for our health and good for the planet look like? So I've taken this from a Public Health Association of Australia policy position statement that I contribute to and wrote with some other academics. And I've got a link for this at the end of the presentation. But firstly, it involves eating a diversity of different foods and not eating more than we need to. It means eating predominantly plant-based foods. So we're talking whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, seeds and nuts, all the good things that John talked about earlier. And it means moderate consumption of dairy foods or other plant foods that contain calcium, meat eaten sparingly, and preferably the whole animal, fish eaten from sustainable fisheries, drinking tap water over sugar-sweetened beverages and plastic bottled water, and of course, limiting the consumption of ultra-processed foods. And what does that look like? So this is what it looks like. As you can see on the left side, lots of colorful fruits and veggies, moderate consumption of meat and dairy. And on the right, we have all our ultra-processed foods and fried foods and things that we need to eat less of. So in the middle, we're talking diversity. So you'll see that there are some nice cakes and a bowl of potato chips in there, but the majority is veggies and whole grains. So we don't have to eliminate it, but we just want to be giving ultra-processed foods and meat and dairy a less central role in our diet. So I like to think about it like we should be shopping the perimeter of the supermarket and trying to avoid most of the middle aisles that are selling packaged foods. Even better though would be shopping direct from farmers markets who are usually selling local produce grown sustainably, and thus we're giving directly to those farmers. Although I understand that farmers markets aren't readily available in every area and they can be more expensive. So it's not always an option for everyone. So what are we currently eating at the moment? I found this pretty neat graph that shows we're eating a lot of ultra processed foods. So the average adult is currently having about 5 to 7 serves a day of ultra processed foods. The average child is consuming 3 to 8 serves per day. And as I said earlier, research has come out of our group actually that says around 40% of our total energy intake at the moment is coming from ultra processed foods. So why do we think this has happened? Have we just lost all our willpower as a society? The answer is no, we have not. As I said earlier, there are a few key players in the food system that have helped make ultra processed foods and meat and dairy products ubiquitous, and would probably prefer to keep the power status quo despite some of the public claims that they're sharing otherwise. Now, I said earlier that our corporatized food system was run by a few select actors, and we can see here, especially in relation to ultra processed foods, who some of those transnational companies are. So Nestle, Coca-Cola, Unilever, and PepsiCo are all examples of major conglomerates who have an immense amount of power in our food system. In Australia, in addition to that, our meat and sugar industries are also very powerful. And this power looks like providing large donations to political members, sponsoring scientific research, sitting on advisory committees in food policy making, and advocating for self-regulation over government regulation, which generally has pretty minimal impact. And this means that our food environment continues to promote mostly ultra-processed and animal-sourced foods, and attempts to regulate this. You might have seen newspaper articles about sugar taxes or marketing restrictions. Efforts to implement things like this have been really difficult. And companies, I think, would prefer to market products that look more sustainable or give you a sustainable option, but often those products aren't. And so just next slide, yeah. You may have seen in the news or in some of the articles lately about the push for plant-based diets, and I basically just described one for you just now. And one example here is the promotion of plant-based meats or lab-based meats, and they've been advocated for people by Bill Gates and Richard Branson, and there are some really big companies that have taken the term plant-based pretty loosely. So these are products that are supposed to taste exactly like meat, have similar nutritional profiles, but none of the environmental or animal welfare impacts of animal-based meat, and they're being heavily marketed as sustainable alternatives to meat. And as a result, some of these novel protein companies are hugely growing in influence and power in the food system. But the evidence actually says that plant-based meat is really not much better for the environment or your health. So yes, it does have lower greenhouse gas emissions and land use relative to red meat, but there are another ultra-processed foods that rely on industrial ingredients, and so will continue to depend on a limited number of crops like soy and coconut oil, and then the high emissions associated with their processing and global distribution. And the research is actually showing that environmental impact of these foods sits somewhere between that of chicken and pork. And so they don't really compare when we're talking about lentils and minimally processed whole foods and vegetables. So what we're actually better off doing is not buying these products, but eating less meat, eating more diverse types of meat, and increasing our intake of leafy greens, legumes, and vegetables. And I think one of the biggest red flags of novel proteins is who exactly is behind the push for them. So some of the biggest investors in novel protein companies have been the incumbent meat packing companies, who are now trying to converge on a new market called the protein market, which encompasses their existing products, so animal source protein like meat, but also these new plant-based proteins that are, analogs to meat. So they're just leveraging new market opportunities via these new technologies, and they're not the only ones. So are big processing companies like Nestle and Unilever, and so are, I mentioned Silicon Valley earlier. Silicon Valley have been one of the biggest lenders of funds for the development of these products. And there's some research coming out of Oxford University at the moment that talks about how Silicon Valley funding food means that food needs to fit the Silicon Valley model. So it needs to be innovative, it needs to have capacity for intellectual property, and none of the health or sustainability priorities are in there. So we do have to be really cautious when big companies tell us that they're offering a sustainable alternative, and assess whether we're actually genuinely getting, whether they're genuinely putting public and planetary interests in line with financial ones. So if we know that our food system is going to be greatly impacted by climate change, why isn't the government enacting any food policy? Partly it's because there are some members of our government that deny that climate change is a problem, but mostly it's because effective policy making would mean a total paradigm shift. So up until now, with regard to food, we've really prioritized economic growth as our #1 goal, but we need to add a little bit more to the picture. So in Australia, agriculture, particularly red meat, is a major economic resource. And so policy making that constrains any potential growth is seen as unfavorable. And instead, they've chosen to preference technology-based solutions, so newer farming technologies, which are somewhat effective, but evidence has shown us that technology alone will not be effective to achieve the environmental goals that we've got. It's just not enough. And on top of this, a lot of people in Australia are unaware of the links between the food they consume and their environmental impact. So an example of when industry has its way on policymaking is the Health Star rating, which I'm sure you've all seen in the supermarket. So it was an initiative designed with the goal of reducing obesity and diet-related diseases by giving consumers more information on the healthiness of foods. But the development of the Health Star rating had the food industry at the decision-making table. So this resulted in a labeling scheme that was voluntary. So not all food products have to display a rating. It also resulted in a labeling calculation that omitted processing as a metric. So some unhealthy products get a health halo and are highly rated despite being ultra processed and unhealthy foods. And some examples are on the right there. We also know from some research that's been undertaken by some academics in my group is that there's little evidence that the Health Star rating has led to really meaningful changes in purchasing behavior. So when the food industry is able to have a say on policies that favor public health over economic interests, we don't get effective policy. And if we do not challenge the current status quo, we risk reinforcing a system that cannot, in its current form, protect human and planetary health in the long term. So what does that mean for us as advocates for healthy and sustainable food systems? What can we do? And for a start, you can share some of the knowledge that you've learned today with people in your community and people that you know. You can set the example by eating a healthy and sustainable diet if it's within your means. It's not always accessible to everybody. But we also want to advocate to our government for more transparent policy-making processes, removal of lobbying and political donations from the food industry, and refusing industry funding or sponsoring of food policy committees. And we can also advocate to our local councils for local food system strategies or local food system policies. So I'll just refer you to the organisation that I run with 2 other colleagues at Deakin at this web address there. So we've got some policy position statements with more information about some of this stuff. We've done some media, and the policy submissions and government letters that we've sent are all on our website if you want to find out more. And of course, if you want to join us as an advocate, we would welcome you. But there are also lots of other advocacy groups that are working in this space, and we've been fortunate enough to work with them and learn from them. So they've been advocating for public health and the environment for a long time. And I think it's really important as advocates that we sing from the same hymn sheet, that we're, united as a voice, because there are some other more financially resourced actors out there who have a lot more capacity to advocate for their interests than we do. A lot of us are doing this on the side of our PhDs that are due in 3 months' time. But yeah, they're really important organizations that are doing a lot of good work. And if you'd like to do any further reading, there are some links here. So most of this information came from the work that I did with the Public Health Association of Australia. So the two bottom links are some policy position statements on the food system, diet and the environment, but also about climate disruption and how there's that bi-directional link between food systems and climate. And if you'd like to find out more about me specifically, you're welcome to email me at that address, or I'm also on Twitter, and a list of all the papers that I published there. So I hope that was interesting, and I hope I gave you some food for thought, and I'm here for the rest of the session. So I really look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Kate. I learned a lot. I think it's really interesting. We get to make some individual choices, some of us, but it's, behind the scenes is a lot for us to consider as well. I'm sure everybody's being challenged and intrigued by some of what you've heard tonight. So we're going to give you a chance to discuss some of your thoughts and your reactions in breakout groups. John, are you able to just pop into the chat the questions for the breakout rooms?
Yeah, I did that.
Oh, did I miss that? Sorry. So when you get into your rooms, just introduce yourself. What was the main insight that you gained so far, and what questions and issues have been raised for you? We'll have about 10 minutes or a bit less, and then we'll come back for question and discussion.
So someone just said they couldn't see the questions.
Yeah, I couldn't either.
Yeah, I think it just
So
said
that's-
the breakout rooms, but didn't include the question.
No, that's just gone now. Great.
Hi, John.
Hi there.
We have time now for some questions and answers. Kate, we've got a few requests to have the slides shared afterwards. Just check with you how you...
That should be fine. There's one slide that has the framework from my colleague here that I'll probably need to take out, but I'll send you a revised version, Alice, and then you're fine to share.
Fantastic. So feel free to go ahead, type some of the questions you had coming out of your group chats or some others that you've thought of. If you can add them into the chat. If you don't have access to the chat, and that's going to be a barrier to you being able to ask a question, you can use the raise hand icon, which is in the reactions button, and we'll call on you from there. We did have a question earlier about canned lentils versus raw lentils, Kate, and what do you think about that, or what are the things we should be thinking about when we're talking about canned products versus raw products?
Yeah, so canned vegetables and canned lentils and canned fruits come under, so there's a framework for assessing the degree of processing of foods. Ultra processed foods are level 4. And canned vegetables, it's an annoying name that they've given this level, but they just call it processed foods. So that's not necessarily bad. Ultra processed foods are the ones that we want to avoid. processed foods generally are fine. So that will also include things like your pastas and things that contain a few ingredients, have been prepared in a particular way. You could make it at home, for example, are fine. And I think when we're taught, what's better, canned versus fresh, it just depends on what your ultimate goals are. So canned lentils are great if you don't have that much time and you just need to whack it into dal or whatever you're preparing for food. So obviously there's higher sodium levels and things like that in canned foods, but really when we're comparing it to what's in an ultra processed food, it can't be compared.
Fantastic. We've got a couple of questions in around the idea of local food systems and local councils. Do you have some examples or suggestions what people might want to campaign for?
Sure. So what I will do, I'll put a link into the chat here. If you click on that link and go to the bottom, Vic Health has compiled a list of some of the local councils that have done some great work and have put together their own food policies. So I guess the important thing to note is we also don't want to health halo local food. It is better that we reduce the food miles, but it's not always necessarily making the best food. So it has to be taken in the context of what foods are coming out of that local network. But yeah, so there's a few in there. So we've got like Manningham City Council, City of Ballarat, Greater Bendigo. So they're all examples of councils that have put together some strategies, and there might be some examples in there. I don't do a lot of work on local food systems, so I'm certainly no expert and haven't really looked into this, but of what challenges they've faced in putting those together and talking about how they've managed to implement that and what effects it's had. That's
excellent, and that's a great resource. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Yes.
And Lee and Graham, you had a question. I might get you to come off mute and ask your question, although I cannot see you on my screen. I'm sure that is possible. I might.
Yep. Sorry. Here we are. Hi, Kate. Thanks for your presentation. We're just asking about feedlots essentially, and is there some information around? I'm assuming additional pollution. And of course, the grain that's grown to feed cattle in feedlots. So the difference between grain finished beef to grass fed,
Yes.
and how much worse that is for that. Well, again, my understanding is that it's really bad for the animal. They experience a lot of pain in having that grain, but also how much worse it is for the environment. Is that something that you're able to share any light on?
Yes. Yeah, I don't have any stats off the top of my head, but broadly a lot worse. And so something to note is, so in the US, for example, about 85 to 95% of the meat that they produce are done in what are called CAFO, so concentrated feeding lots. In Australia and New Zealand, because we've got the type of environment where you can do pastoral grazing, we don't produce red meat in that way. A lot of the meat is finished on a feedlot just before slaughter, but the majority of their lives are not spent in feedlots, and it does make a huge difference, absolutely. So a lot of the deforestation that happens in the Amazon, that soybean is used for animal feed, and I think, I don't know enough about it, but I'm pretty sure also the types of like methane emissions kind of change depending on what they're fed and the general life that they have. So it is on a scale, and I think that's, despite researching, the politics of meat, I certainly wouldn't advocate that we all need to go vegetarian. I think there are ways that we can eat meat in a healthy and sustainable way. But yeah, it does require knowing, I guess, where the meat has come from, and perhaps limiting the intake of red meat. And that includes pork. I don't think everyone always includes pork as a red meat source, but yeah, just trying to diversify, perhaps eating more blue foods, so foods from the ocean, and different types of bird species are probably the way to go when we're talking about diversification.
We've got a question from Ken. Can you come off mute, Ken, and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Alice. So we talk about the importance of having diversity in our diet. If the entire world was to adopt a Mediterranean diet, that would mean we'll lose diversity in our diet, right? Is that a bad thing for our health and for our planet? Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of people love the Mediterranean diet, and certainly ad nauseum there have been papers published that promote the Mediterranean diet as being generally healthy. I think first of all, we need to make sure that everyone's has a consistent definition of Mediterranean, because certainly people currently living in the Mediterranean are not eating a Mediterranean diet. They're eating similar diets to us in the West, which is a lot of ultra processed foods. Look, I don't know enough. I don't know what would happen if the whole world shifted to a Mediterranean diet. I think something else to think about is we eat food not just for health and the planet and for you know, our for fuel for our bodies. We also eat it because we enjoy it. And there are lots of cultures all around the world that have really, really rich histories with food preparation and make amazing dishes that, you know, people would not want to give up, I'm sure. So yeah, I don't think I would advocate for that. But one thing I will say is the Mediterranean diet is quite diverse. It contains a lot of diverse fruits and vegetables, diverse types of meats, olive oils, seeds and nuts. So in terms of our health, it's certainly a good diet to follow. But yeah, it would probably mean that we're producing, you know, mass amounts of you know, olive trees to make olive oil and that kind of thing. And yeah, that has its own implications for sure.
I know that I was very surprised to learn that the Mediterranean diet was not just gyros. I was quite disappointed.
Yeah.
John, you've got your hand up.
Look, this is just coming out of the Maintain Your Brain study, and basically they were looking at interpreting or saying, you know, you can apply the concept of the Mediterranean diet to different cultures. You know, what does an Asian version of the Mediterranean diet look like, or a South American or an Arabic, you know, so it's more the concept of those sorts of combinations of foods. So maybe that retains some of the variety you know, it's more, yeah, applying that concept to different cultures and a broader range of foods, rather than just saying, oh, this is Mediterranean, you've got to stick to that.
Yeah.
I've got a few questions coming in here, some suggestions of books to read, or perhaps we could campaign towards Coles and Woolworths. One of the questions is, you know, you described there is a complex and powerful system at play in our food systems. Are there some areas for change that would be perhaps easier, or where change is already happening that we could put some energy behind?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that's where the local city councils can be really impactful, and it also, I guess, keeps you motivated. So working with your local council to yeah, to be more conscientious, I suppose. I mean, we are seeing some changes. I mean, interestingly, the South Australian government that just got elected in have had a policy on not accepting political donations. That is, you know, unheard of, really, for most of the country. So I thought that was really, really motivating. The other thing is seeing, so the Australian dietary guidelines are being revised at the moment, and people are increasingly asking for the guidelines to incorporate sustainability within those recommendations, because, you know, a sustainable diet is ultimately what's going to be best for our health as well. And what's been very reassuring is to see that in previous iterations of the guidelines, there have been undue influence from the food industry. The National Health and Medical Research Council, who undertake the review of the guidelines, have a separate webpage where they post any single communication from any actor that have approached them, what they wanted to say, and how they've dealt with it, which is a huge amount of transparency that we haven't seen in policy making before. So there are changes happening, and we do have reason to feel comforted. And I know a lot of what I said in the presentation probably felt a bit overwhelming and felt like, you know, oh my gosh, I'm just an individual. I've got, you know, I can't do anything. And of course, there are things we can do as an individual, and trying to eat the diet in the first place is probably the best place to start. And also just sharing this information. I mean, there have been studies coming out based in Australia looking at what people's awareness of the environmental impacts of various foods. And it's not common knowledge. I suppose some of the messages aren't getting there. I mean, I suppose meat has been out there, and I can see someone said, talking about animal cruelty, and that the movements that have the advocacy movements on animal cruelty have been unbelievable in pushing this movement forward and raising awareness to people about the impacts of their food and what happens to the people involved. A lot of people don't know there's a lot of human worker exploitation in the meat industry as well. So it's not just the animals. So there's a lot of opaqueness in the industry that is kind of being unveiled by different advocacy groups. And I think sharing those messages and making people aware and I guess trying to be conscious consumers. And I'm very wary of that term because I think the onus is not entirely on the individual. These are systems problems, but we're all part of the system and we all have a role to play. So yeah, I guess that would be my recommendation.
Fantastic. I think we might have time for one question. This one's come from Jim, which is, he's saying that over the next 50 years, the world will eat more food than the world's eaten in the past. And how are our production levels and what's looking like happening?
Yes, this is the paradigm of which our government produces food policy at the moment. So the idea that we don't have enough food is a myth. We have enough food. We will have enough food. We're not, we'll have enough food if we start to enact some changes. But so after World War II, there was a policy ideology called productivism, which is very academic and you don't really need to know that term, but the idea was to, that we never want to be reliant on rations again. We want to make sure everybody has enough food. And so that's when agricultural subsidies came in. That's when this real push for making as much food as we can. And that's kind of how we've ended up here, is the more time went on and the more we pushed this idea that we need to make more and more food, the more we started taking shortcuts and we started saying, oh, well, we just need to intensively produce food. We'll externalize all the costs onto, public health and the environment, just so long as we can keep producing food. And that's kind of fed into the financialization of food, because the more we grow food, the more it's ripe for making money, I suppose. So I guess I'd be cautious about seeing messages that promote the idea that we're not going to have enough food. We will have enough food. We've absolutely got the resources to, but it's about living within our means and within the natural balance of the environment. So really changing what foods we're producing and moving away from ones that aren't good for us and aren't good for the planet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. That has been really fascinating for me how little I knew about all of this. And I think, what I've really heard tonight is how we consume also matters outside of just our own health and bodies, that there is this interconnectedness, so that the food industry has its own interconnectedness, but we have that interconnectedness too. I was thinking about this today. You know, last year we ran a session on solar panels, and the uptake of solar panels during the pandemic was phenomenal, right? So even though that the government policies aren't there, we as individuals have gone, no, we're going to do this. We're going to get the solar panels. But because the policies aren't in place, it's pushed forward things like the closure of the Eraring power plant. And that is a huge thing for a community. So we know that it's necessary to shut these power plants, but this needs to be done in a way that is for the benefit of people and with the community, not to the community. And so we live in this tension of there are things we can do and that we should do as individuals, but also we get to come together and be part of activating others to be part of this change. What can we do in the Lake Macquarie community as part of the Uniting Church to make sure that community members get a seat at the table? You know, what can we do together? We can reflect on our own diet, but we can also, you know, think about, well, where else? What are our points of change that we can make? I was very interested in that kind of local council idea as well. To that end, we're also focusing in the Uniting Climate Action Network about events in the lead up to the federal election, where we're trying to advocate for the kind of policies that we need for climate action. Don's just popped into the link the registration for the Pacifica Climate Election Forum. So this is a forum where we've invited a range of politicians to, including the Environment Minister, the Shadow Environment Minister, and the candidates for both Lindsay and Macquarie. And it's an opportunity, it's going to be at Penrith Panthers on the 27th of April, and it's an opportunity for us to share our stories about what the impact of climate change is happening, particularly in Western Sydney communities, but also for the people in those communities, for their families in their home countries in the Pacific Islands. And in the lead up to that, we're having a forum, a youth climate policy forum. That's online, that's on the 20th of April. And that's looking at what does good climate policy look like, so that when we head into the election, we can actually be looking for some specific things. So it is a youth climate policy forum, but I certainly will be there as somebody who is interested in the answer to what does good climate policy look like, and everybody is invited to be part of that as well. I really want to say a massive thank you to all of you being here tonight. We weren't sure how far Zoom fatigue had set in for people, so we're really pleased that so many of you could join us. And a really huge thank you to Kate for giving us your time and your wisdom and the benefit of your experience tonight. I felt very challenged and excited by what you were talking about, so really very much thank you from us all. I'm going to farewell you tonight with a Māori farewell, which is Haere mai te aotonga ea, home ie, hu ie, taiki e. And that translates to let peace be among us, let us join, gather, act, or another translation for that is Amen.